Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 69 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Curt and Jerry. As part of our heart rate variability series, we're going to kind of take a pause from the articles. I titled this episode that Matt has some questions about heart rate variability. So I want to look at just kind of, in some ways, a summary of what we've talked about, and also really maybe diving just a little bit deeper into the conversations we've been having. So I've got some questions for Curt and Jerry, and I'm excited to start to explore those. So as always, we start out our podcast with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And hey, I got mine right on the top of my head, so I'll start us out this week. And I've last couple weeks have done a series or a couple trainings with the Greenwood Village Police Department in the southern Denver metro area, and it's been my first training. I've had a lot of police in trainings before. I've done a lot of criminal justice trainings, but it's the first time I got to train an entire police department, and I sort of, the best way I can describe the experience is what it must have been like for an early explorer to find a new island or continent, spend a little time on that continent, learn a whole heck of a lot. Not sure whether what I left them behind, hopefully something positive, but it really fun to explore, and great folks doing some amazing work down there. And I'm so excited that trauma-informed policing is a thing. And hopefully a term more and more. You Google it, there's not a ton there right now, but hopefully another area where this paradigm will have an impact. So it was really exciting to, again, visit someone else's continent and learn from them as well. So, Curt, what's your bright, shiny object of the week?
I had two of them. One was I was in a meeting yesterday and didn't expect to get any kind of feedback or mention of this podcast, but I did in the middle of the meeting, which was kind of fun. That we had a listener who was in the meeting and he brought it up. So that was really fun to hear the feedback about that and how it had. He's a policymaker, so it was one of those where he's like, I needed to learn lots of jargon and lingo coming from a non-behavioral health field. So podcasts are a great way to do that, and he had used some of our episodes to do that, which was fun to hear about.
Very cool. Very cool.
Also, I had one more, and recently I have a really great group of clinicians who are currently working with me with adults with intellectual disabilities, and they're using heart rate to help a lot of individuals to start to be aware of their internal state, and then use that as a way to engage socially with their providers and those around them in a different way, in a more constructive, positive way. And we did our first symptom reassessment using a standardized instrument with one of our first patients. And this is a 6-month reassessment, and the reductions in symptom intensity were like at least a full standard deviation on every single measure, which is really cool to see. It was really fun to see. And I got to see her logs of, we're having her measure 3 times a day. What's her heart rate, and then what is her emotional state, or what's the affect that she feels at that moment. And you could see, as she wrote over the last 6 months, most of the affective statements, or her experience of the state, was feeling frustrated or angry. And as you look down the list for 6 months, you started seeing proud and happy, and just lots of different changes in the way she reported her internal state. It was really fun to see. It was really exciting to look at.
Very cool. Very cool. Jerry, what about you? What's your bright, shiny object of the week?
You know, my bright, shiny object is I started reading a book by Joe Dispenza on breaking the habit of being yourself. And really talking about, as we talk about these states that we create, right? Based on our heart and based on our ability to be open and curious versus kind of defensive and constricted, is how being in these different states influences what you manifest in your life, right? As you talked about this individual who's now reporting a different internal experience, how that's going to influence how she sees life and how she sees relationships and opportunities versus approaching things versus defending. And so really trying to kind of look at really not just from a kind of the trauma end, which is really a part of our podcast, but really all of us in some ways have prior associations to experiences that we compare to what we did in the past, as opposed to being open to what's available in the present, right? And so trying to kind of really think deeply about how we can apply this to my own growth as an individual, but also is how I can kind of approach my clients in a way that creates the space for them to have a different experience. I think that's so much of what happens in a therapeutic process is that you resonate with your client's emotional experience. It organizes you in a particular way, and that you've got to really, in some ways, be healthy and regulated and open and curious, and so that they can somehow join you and resonate with you in that process. So I've taken some of this stuff we're talking about and really kind of look at is how can I use it in my own life, not just for my clients, but bring my best self to the work.
Very cool. Excellent. Great, bright, shiny objects this week. So let's start with some of my questions on heart rate variability. So I guess my first question to throw out there is, I think we've talked a lot, the fear response, social engagement, behavioral stuff, a lot of different pieces of heart rate variability. So my first question is kind of a simple question. What does and then I'll give complex follow-ups.
That remains to be seen if this is
exactly. So kind of what the heck does a measurement of heart rate variability tell us? And as sort of the second part of that question, what doesn't it tell us? Because it seems to be telling us a lot by the articles we're reading. So let's just start kind of with the basics of, well, what's heart rate variability measurement tell us? What doesn't it tell us?
You want me to take that one, Jerry?
You can go ahead. It's an easy question.
Sure.
Told you at first, but easy.
He's set me up there. I get the sense that you might be setting me up, Jerry.
How's your heart rate variability doing?
So I think certainly, Matt, one of the challenges is that you can really get lost in the details of understanding heart rate variability. And there is a lot of benefit to understanding the details of heart rate variability. I think it's really important in terms of having an additional lens to view what people do and what people feel and how people think through. I think it's really important in that sense. And to really simplify it, one of the things that it tells us is it helps us to be able to stay connected to somebody's internal experience and always have that in the forefront of our minds as we're engaging in so many different activities, whether that be clinically therapeutic activities, whether it be work-related activities where we have to produce growth and change, whether it be in a meeting with somebody. So thinking about how somebody's stress response is so quickly responsive to what's going on around them. And that can change on a moment's notice. And this heart rate variability measure, some of the details of this are so critical as we talk about people's ability to socially engage is like predicted by heart rate variability, and it's influenced by how our stress response is operating on a moment-to-moment basis. That's a really important perspective to carry, I think, consistently. When we think about the article about fear conditioning, that people's ability to overcome fears that they have learned previously in their life and to learn safety cues, which I think is even more important, to learn when you're safe and when you're not safe, is predicted by our physiology. It's not determined by our physiology, but it's predicted in a pretty consistent way. And so thinking about those kinds of things as we're engaging in teaching students new things, when we're engaged in learning new things ourselves, or when we're thinking about people want to change habits, right? As I think, Jerry's bright shiny object was really kind of apropos, that as we think about growth and change as something that, as professionals, I would hope that we're all committed to, especially in the helping fields, growth and change ourselves and then helping others to grow and change. So much of that is predicted by our physiology, which is tied to our social and non-social environments. So it can tell us many, many, many things, and it can be as simple as it keeps us connected to somebody's internal state as something that's really important to be in the forefront of our minds.
So Jerry, I'll let you add anything, but in some ways, I'm kind of more fascinated with the second part. What doesn't it tell us? I mean,
so let me give you my simple version, right? Because I have to kind of. It's really this measurement is a way to operationalize stress sensitivity. Simple, right? And if we look at it from previous discussions we've had, it's a way for us to have some measurement of our window of tolerance. So when you have high stress, high heart rate variability, the width of your window of tolerance is greater than when you have low. So you're going to, using what Curt said, is the lower your heart rate variability, the harder it is for you to stay social engaged and the easier it is for you to activate defensive systems. The higher your heart rate variability, the wider your window of tolerance is, so you can engage socially and you can play, you can learn, you can grow, you can explore, right? And so if we think about that from an individual, or we think about that from a parent can engage with their child with high heart rate variability as this operational measure of stress sensitivity, and be able to tolerate a wider range of emotional experiences for that child. So in some ways, there's a piece of this that's heredity, but the experiences that you have are going to be influencing this along the way to kind of look at that, right? So if our listeners just think about this in terms of stress sensitivity, and for them, they can use this model of the window of tolerance, and the way that we are wanting to have some way of measuring that, if you choose to measure that, is to use this RSA, right, to be able to measure that sensitivity piece. That's the simple piece. So in a way, what it doesn't tell us is what somebody's subjective experience of all this is, right? If I live in a very high level reactive place, am I comfortable there? Right? So some of our clients, as Curt talked about a client he had, when they calm down, they're actually less comfortable, right? So it doesn't tell us about people's subjective experience of that. And it doesn't tell us about the relational environment they're living in. So somebody can have a lower heart rate stress variability, but has a lot of relational support that, even though they can't make as maximum use of it, it's better than not having any of it, right? So we have to really understand these measures, both in the individual, what it means, but also in the relational environment that they're in. So the situation that, so what is the context in which this is occurring? Does that make some sense?
And two, one of the things that I think is important about that, Jerry, is that it helps us with this propensity and habit that most humans have, which is to infer intent.
Right.
And it helps us to have a more sophisticated way of inferring intent. And we get all kinds of tripped up when we infer intent, and we're often really mistaken about that. And the more that we have kind of some cognitive structures and some ways of thinking about things that we can reappraise when we infer intent, it helps us to stay engaged and helps us to design interventions and create programs that are, I think, more robust and more likely to be successful.
Yeah.
So you look like you had a question, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I think what with your answer, I really like the part about the window of tolerance, because I think that gives a kind of a more, I guess for me, a tangible historical model of kind of, and just for our listeners, we had an episode on window of tolerance, which I really, if you haven't listened to it, to go back and listen to it. But basically talks, if you're inside your window of tolerance, you're basically, in many ways, operating out of the logical parts of your brain. And if, as I like to say, you're sort of, your body fills with cortisol, the stress hormone, it starts to, fill that up. So, really looking at, so I really like that piece. I guess one of the things that I struggle a little bit more with, Jerry, with your answer is, with the social engagement piece, it wasn't that one article showing that the heart rate variability probably reflects the amount of social support. And so somebody with more social support would have a better heart rate variability measure.
No, what I'm saying to you is that if I'm dealing with somebody who's got low heart rate variability and high stress sensitivity,
okay,
right? They're going to be easily moved into a defensive spot.
Yeah.
If I'm surrounded by people or structures or whatever it is that are well regulated, and I remain open to that child to help regulate them.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in an environment where I have low heart rate variability and stress sensitivity, and I'm in a highly disorganized, stressed, chaotic environment, I don't have anybody there to help me, right? And so part of our job when we're building programs or we're interacting with people with low heart rate variability, they're not going to be in a spot to be really receptive and open. We can't personalize that, and we have to use our regulatory places to be open and compassionate to them, even though they are not necessarily open, right? So when you deal with, say, a foster parent who expects this child to come in and be happy and thankful and safe that they're there, we've got to help that foster parent stay in their social engagement system, not be organized by the defensive behavior of this child, right? To kind of look at that. So what I'm saying is, I can have somebody who has low heart rate variability sensitivity, but if they're surrounded by really people who are compassionate, socially engaged, and to do it, that child is much more likely to have an ability to get back regulated and have a different experience. If their reactivity causes a reactivity in the people around me,
yeah.
Does that mean? So
yeah.
That's why when I'm trying to understand this individual, we have to understand in the context of the relational and milieu that they're in, the relational environment that they're in. That you can have a really defensive, reactive person who's around really well-regulated people who don't react to those things, which is why this whole concept, theoretically, of having trauma-informed environments is really to help create well-regulated systems around people who are in with these low heart rate variabilities. But for our listeners, you could think about it as for people who have narrow windows of tolerance, right? Not everybody's going to use these measurements. So if you kind of think about that measurement really is telling us how wide their window of tolerance is.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. So does it not tell us something though? Because it seems that, I mean, even though, Jerry, I think in some ways I totally agree with what you're saying, but it seems to be predictive of everything.
Well,
I mean, or not predictive. Let me rephrase. It's a measure of everything, even though we may not get some of the details.
It is related to a lot of functions, a lot. I mean, when you think about our ability to flexibly respond to environmental demands, this is really, it's related to our ability to do that because it's connected to so many important brain structures and functions and so much of our body, right? This whole innervation pathway goes all the way from our prefrontal cortex through our limbic system to our brainstem to our heart to our gut. It's one of those things where it's like we see the more we learn, the more we find out that we didn't know.
So Matt, what it doesn't tell us yet, we haven't really talked about what are the interventions that are most effective at altering somebody's heart rate variability, right? So we have a reading of somebody's state or trait. Now, what are the things that for that individual that's going to help them move back to social engagement and be able to have experiences that begin to regulate, right? Is that diet? Is that the environmental things? Is that their relation? Is that physical movement kind? All these interventions we do ultimately because what we know is this stress sensitivity is also related early in life to epigenetics and in terms of your risk for health problems, your risk, right, as the ACEs studies. So what we want to take this information now is to be able to say is, let's look at what are not only the intervention, but what are the sequence of intervention, right? So, if you looked at, say, for example, Dr. Perry's neurosequential model, he would talk a lot about pattern repetitive activity, movement, things that go on to regulate the body before you're able to engage in a relationship, before you're able to use top-down cognitive reasoning. That's a sequence of interventions. We can actually use some of these measures to kind of say how is that process working? To kind of look at that. So, as we move on in our understanding, we can use some of this information to guide how we structure. And some of the things we were doing, we're going to learn, aren't very therapeutic.
Yeah.
Some of the things
but it kind of tells us that, right?
Right. But some of the things we're doing naturally in our environments that we've gotten rid of, like going out to the park and playing, being able to kind of explore, being able to go to kindergarten and just play with toys and kind of, some of those things may be really, really resilient building.
So let me throw out what's in my head right now and see if I'm on the right page. So
try to screen it first before it makes
check my variability. So future, and I think what's really exciting about this is it's here. We can get these measures fairly simple on the phones we have in our pocket now. I think the technology will catch up very quickly to this as the science is showing how valuable it is too to get, at this point, I think it's hard to get a real time reading of variability with the technology, at least that I've researched, to get that in real time, like a heart rate, where you've got, on your smartphone or whatever. So Jerry, what I'm hearing from you is you take a measurement And then you may have a standardized list of interventions that, and again, this is kind of future thinking a little bit, but I mean, I'm talking maybe about next year, not 10 years from now. You sort of, a program could have a set sort of, okay, if you have high heart rate variability, this is what the intervention might be, medium, low. Again, I'm just really making this incredibly simple. And then you would try one of those interventions for kind of where that individual's at, and then take another measurement to see if that intervention is effective for that person specifically.
Right. So what we're talking about is eventually having individually designed medical care, individually designed psychiatric care, right? Is I'm going to have a much better understanding of what you need as opposed to you come to me and I deliver what right? Is that we can do it. But really, not everybody in the field is going to be doing this research. We just have to be able to figure out is what's the research telling us, and then how to deliver it in right. And the people who are doing the research have really good skills and are really good at this. They're maybe not the best people to deliver the care.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, so again is, how do we put this in language when we talk about the window of tolerance, and that people can make use of this stuff to kind of look at that? But really, we're beginning to understand that experience has really long-term negative impacts on people, right? Mm-hmm. Exposure things. But we also, if it has negative effects, what are the experiences we have to expose people to with enough repetition to get positive outcomes?
Yeah.
That's the really, that's the $1 million question. How do we sequence the experiences we're exposing people to? And then how do we create the environments that are best designed to deliver those experiences? Which is what Curt's degree was in, developing these environments.
Yeah. So let me, because I think I could stay on this question the whole time, but I'm dying to get to the next question. We could extend this series out forever. Maybe just rename the podcast if we're not careful. Okay, another question I asked a while ago was whether heart rate variability was a trait or something in our previous conversations that we would talk about a trait being sort of a long-term, a long-term way of being, I guess, because I don't want to use the word state in my definition of trait. Whereas a state is where you're at sort of more in that moment. And I asked the question a while ago, is heart rate variability a state or a trait? And we kind of came to the agreement, I think, that it was a trait, but I'm not sure that's, I kind of think maybe it's both. So my question is, here's my thinking, and inform me right, wrong, way off in left field is, so something like repeated traumatic experiences during childhood creates a certain kind of trait. And I would think that trait, as it would manifest itself in heart rate variability, would mean lower heart rate variability. And then again, if somebody doesn't get treatment, they've had repeated traumatic experiences. But then it seems like heart rate variability also measures fluctuations within that trait. So in some ways, your heart rate variability will stay somewhat consistent, but there is a huge amount of fluctuation depending on the mood you're in, the level of stress you're holding, the window of tolerance. So it seems like both a state and a trait.
I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of some of the articles that we've read, is that it does change more rapidly than I think previously thought. Mm-hmm. That I think that the thinking about heart rate variability as a measure is that it was more stable and less dynamic than it actually is. And it turns out that it's pretty dynamic.
Yeah.
That, I mean, there are some, kind of like you can think about windows of tolerance, and there could be multiple windows of tolerance within a window of tolerance. So that can change with heart rate variability. And some of that came from a lot of the studies we haven't really talked about, which come from the world of athletic training, that your heart rate variability scores and measures can change with what kind of workout you did the previous day.
Yeah.
And there are intraday measures even that it can change within a day.
Yeah.
So,
well, my like scores can jump within the hundreds of percentiles. Like if I do a measure before a training and then after a training, I mean, you're talking about, you know, I'm good to go. And it's like, well, you should just go to sleep now. Like, so even after like a 4-hour training yesterday, great training, had a blast. And yet you look at measures just 4 hours apart, and you've got hundreds of percentiles of swings in energy level and stress level that it's measuring. So it's like I had a big window of tolerance, and then I had no window of tolerance. I mean, it's that sort of dramatic.
So Matt, think about it. Think about it in terms of an episode we had on homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is a set point.
Yeah.
Allostasis from Bruce McEwen is the mechanisms that allow us to regulate getting out and back to these set points, right? So what you're talking about from this state is I get stressed and now I have to kind of recoup myself, and my body's able to recoup myself, and I'm able to do that, right? That's those are states. However, imagine being in a chaotic, threatening, overwhelming environment for a prolonged amount of time. That has to do with allostatic load, how much your body's having to do that, which actually begins to change the set points and actually begins to have wear and tear on your body to kind of look at that, right? So we have this ability to change states, but if we stay in a state for a prolonged amount of time, our systems become sensitized and begin to change and adapt to living in an environment that has consequences for our body. And that becomes more of a trait that you begin to look at that, right? So they're both, right? And instead of thinking about it, is it one or the other, they're both. And you have to hold that, is that we all have this ability to respond to demands and then recoup, right? But if the demands stay in our environment, for example, if I'm an infant or a child in a chaotic, threatening, unresponsive environment, my biology has to somehow change. My nervous system becomes sensitized, and I become more reactive to stress, right? Because I'm having to kind of be in that state, which then has impacts on my immune system, impacts on my endocrine system, impacts on my cardiovascular system, right? To kind of look at that we talked about in the ACEs studies.
Yeah.
Right? So again, we want to find, is it this or this? It's both.
Yeah, and I think
to categorize things, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this is a really important category, because if I was thinking of it as really a trait, you know, I think one of the interesting things about this is the amount of fluctuation. I think a little thing in my own life that I've seen is I love this video game called Civilization, where you build empires and you farm, you do all these like fun things. But my heart rate variability readings after playing those games showed a high level of stress. So while I love these games, you can sit and play them for like, the way I play, you play them for like 18 hours. It's ridiculous, but it's a little bit better than just sitting there and watching TV. But what my heart rate variability says is better just to sit back and watch Game of Thrones. And that's better for me in a weird way. If you have ever watched Game of Thrones, you wouldn't think that's a healthy coping skill. But I'm actually much healthier just sitting back and watching TV than playing that game, or at least my heart rate variability.
Well, Matt, so instead of saying one is better than the other, think about it as because of your heart rate variability, it may be better for you to stress yourself somewhat today and play games.
Yeah.
But if you're staying in this high stressed out state for a prolonged amount of time, it's better for you to do something to down-regulate your systems.
Yeah.
So it's not this state is better than this. This state is what you need to respond to the environment.
Yeah.
Right? We need to be able to activate that sympathetic nervous system we wouldn't survive without it.
Right.
Right? But we wouldn't survive without this ability to then downregulate, restore, and move back to a sense of health and growth.
Yeah.
Right? So it's what you're talking about is what's the balance of these systems, not is this a good system or is this a bad system?
That makes
Right?
totally,
There's a lot of good things associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Flexibility, adaptability, openness to the environment to kind of look at that. But I don't want to be in my parasympathetic nervous system when there's a tiger in the room.
Right.
Right? It's like, that's a great system, but I need this other system to engage me when I need to be engaged.
Yeah.
So when we start to look at bad and good, that's an old model of, this is a good, really they work in unison to be able to, in some ways, adjust our ability to respond to the demands without moving into these kind of, if I got on to the airport today, if I didn't have a parasympathetic brake on my stress response system, I would start attacking people in the airport to get to to kind of looking at that. But because I do, I can get stressed, but stay regulated enough to be able to manage it, right? To kind of looking at that. That's heart rate variability.
Yeah.
It's allowing us to do that piece, right? So that there's a good example of it's the cooperation between these systems. Not one is good and one is bad.
Right. I think it goes to, Jerry, kind of what you were saying too about the interventions is because my job, I love what I do, it is like there's peaks to it, right? I think if you put on a 6-7 hour presentation and you don't leave exhausted, you probably left some stuff on the table, so to speak. So it's like living the life I live. That game might not be the healthiest way for me to spend my downtime. I just need to be a more passive piece of that. So yeah, I think I totally get what you say about good and bad, but I think it's a kind of just in my own personal life, it's an interesting example of kind of that being conscious of a menu of options, so to speak,
right?
Of, okay, what does my biology tell me what I need now? So my pre-measure sort of can tell me, okay, I'm doing rock and roll. I've had a great calm week. I can play 12 hours of civilization. That's probably not healthy no matter what. But I can play the game and it's not going to negatively impact my health after that. Whereas if I've had a really hard week, it might not be the best way to spend my weekend.
There are a couple of points about your example that I think are important to talk about. And one is that this measure of heart rate variability is, as Jerry mentioned earlier, it's separate from subjective experience. It doesn't necessarily tell us subjective experience. And we learned that from the article about comorbid autism and anxiety, that you had these children who had comorbid autism and anxiety, and their subjective experience of anxiety did not track with their changes in heart rate and heart rate variability. They experienced more anxiety and they had higher heart rate variability. It was a really interesting that they are related to one another, but they aren't exactly the same. You don't have exactly the same experience. And that kind of helps us with thinking about how at times our physiology, because of what we've lived through and gone through, can get kind of turned on its head a little bit, where becoming calm doesn't feel right.
Right.
That state doesn't feel normal. And so you get driven to do something to increase your physiological state, which often is in the treatment world of behavioral disorders. We'll hear people describe that as causing crisis.
Sure. Right.
So there's a drive there. The other thing that I think is important about Matt, about your example, is that using the measure, and I think this is kind of speaks to Jerry's question about what intervention should you try and what can work. Just the fact of measuring it got you to be open to a different experience and to think about one game versus another game as beneficial versus non-beneficial. And that's an intervention in and of itself. Yeah. Just doing that can be and I found that to be repeatedly very effective in opening up people's thinking about different possibilities and new ways of interacting with the world and affecting their own biology and physiology.
So to piggyback, I think that was a really good point, Curt, to kind of look at that. So Matt, thinking about Margaret Blaustein's work on the ARC model, to kind of look at that, 3 important questions to ask people. One is, what's your energy level? Where are you at, right, in your body, right? Because you basically say, I know where I'm really up and I know where I'm down, right? The second question is how comfortable is that for you?
Yeah.
Right? You may say it's really good for me to go and watch the Game of Thrones and relax, but that state might not be comfortable for you, which goes back to this issue of when I'm less anxious, my body is more regulated, it feels uncomfortable to me. Mm-hmm. And then the next question is the state you're in effective for doing the job that you're asked to do? So if you had to get up and do another presentation, you wouldn't want to get in a state to watch the Game of Thrones.
Right.
But if you had the opportunity to relax and to do it, you might take that. So there's one of what's your state, and then what's your subjective assessment of that state, and then does it match what you're being asked to do in your current situation?
Yeah.
So that, what does that mean for, say, somebody who's homeless? Mm-hmm. Right? How do I get to a place where I could just sit down and relax and watch the Game of Thrones if I'm homeless and I've got to be right? That may be uncomfortable and create anxiety for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. So the next question, I'm trying to move us along.
Right. So let me ask you, what's your subjective? Do you feel like you got answers to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gives you a lot of insight, and I think it allows you to, the other thing I gave up, which I'm really kind of pissed off about this one, is caffeine, because I could see difference in my heart rate variability before and after I drank my yerba mate, which I love yerba mate, but again, I know I probably had do too much caffeine. So I cut back on that. So it's, I mean, I think that it's you see these trends in your own life, and it does help you. I know. Sage tea. I'm on sage tea now. Doesn't quite give you the boost, though. Feeling a little better. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that it gives us some of those. It gives us a concrete measure because I agree with you, Curt, on the subjective experience piece of it. But at the same time, I think in some ways it might measure subjective experience as well. I think if I could predict, I'm getting to the point where I can predict sort of my heart rate variability by the mood that I'm in and those sort of things as well. So I get that we need to understand the subjective experience on top of this. No argument there, but I think that it's interesting. The more data I get on myself, the more heart rate variability and subjective experience seem to be tied with each other. And that's an N of one being me, but getting there. So my next question, because I think this is one I've also kind of struggled with, is this teaching us anything new about trauma? I think from the articles I've read, I think it's fascinating, and yet I'm not sure I really, as far as like the global knowledge of trauma, I think trauma and heart rate variability, we're learning about how trauma impacts heart rate variability, but have we really learned anything new through heart rate variability about the impact of trauma itself, or is it another sort of data points to back up sort of what we already know?
I can give a kind of a guess to that, but I think Jerry probably answered the question a little bit better than I can. I think one of the things that is super important that it is telling us is it's giving us some information about why some people may be able to go through very traumatic experiences and come out the other side without developing PTSD. That this baseline level of heart rate variability and the way that our physiology is organized can be a protective factor, in addition to social environments and, you know, all of those things that we also know about. But it gives us, as I think you've kind of alluded to, Matt, it gives us a pretty fine-tuned measure that can help us be pretty predictive about understanding why some people may develop PTSD and why some may not. And I think that's one of the key things to pull away from it.
You know, I think the question you're always asking, which is a good question, is how do we translate research into practical clinical application, right? And how do we use research to help us validate and improve clinical application? And sometimes it's easy to make these transitions, and sometimes it takes a level of knowledge and kind of thinking about to translate this. So, you know, we had an episode on epigenetics, the fact that our genes change. Well, what does that mean when I'm with a client? Do I ask you about your genes to kind of looking at that?
Yeah.
But what we know is that experience not only impacts us in the moment, it's going to impact us over a long period of time. And now we know it may even impact the next generation.
Yeah.
Right? But we've got to develop, what does that mean for us to do it? So the best way that I do it is I look at what are the things that I know, like window of tolerance, right? And I say is, okay, so this really is fitting into my understanding of window of tolerance. Or I look at, you know, when I listen to Dr. Perry talk about sensitization versus tolerance building, right? Is that for some individuals, their nervous systems become sensitized. How does this measure fit into that model to kind of look at what's happening biologically that's to kind of do it? But we're really, when I'm with a family, I'm with in a consult with school, I talk about a sensitized nervous system, that this child's ability to manage stress is less, right? I'm not really going to talk to them about the kid's heart rate variability, right? Because for them, they want to know what's the application of that, right? But I do need to understand, because the science is constantly moving and changing and maybe actually challenging beliefs we had. So I have to be adaptive as a clinician to be able to read and understand the science, but it doesn't always translate really clearly. This does, but there are other things that don't really translate very quickly to what I'm doing. Right? So that's why these podcasts of us having dialogues from behavioral learning models to dynamic models to kind of are really good, because it helps us to digest some of this information and make it more practical.
Yeah, great. So the other thing, the thing that I think if I was in a service, like some of my past jobs where I was a program director running programs, I think after listening, well, I know, because I've obviously implemented this in my own program I call my life, that I would feel a lot of cognitive dissonance to figure out a way to utilize heart rate variability to inform my programming, sort of like we've talked about. So I've talked about the Welltory app that I like. Sometimes it's good. I'll leave it at good. I don't think it's great, but it's good. It's taught me a lot about myself, so I think it's worth the investment. But you know, it's relatively cheap to get heart rate variation measures. If people should think about how should I think about integrating this into my programming? Is it at that sort of level yet? Is there a practical application to this for education, child welfare, the justice system? I mean, are we there yet, kind of thing? You know, Curt, it sounds like you're implementing it. and some of your teams working with it. And I just kind of like, I think the cognitive dissonance is, oh crap, we've got a tool. I want to use the tool because it tells us almost everything from our discussions. What advice do you give people like me who are sitting here and saying, we need to know everybody's heart rate variability because it'll tell us if we're successful or not?
I think, I mean, obviously I've used it for a little while and have used really simple technology, not even getting heart rate variability, but just getting heart rate.
Yeah.
And that's been really, really helpful. So I think I would say to anybody who wants to do it, I mean, you can learn a lot about it by reading and understanding a lot of these kind of articles and points that we've talked about. And it's not so scary. Like you're not going to mess it up really. Like you're not going to mess anybody up by being more in tune with their internal state. I would say that you have to know a lot of details because you get a lot of questions about it, as I think evidenced by some of the questions you had today, Matt, and over the course of these series, right? As we think about things like high is good, low is bad. Well, it's not quite that simple. Like sometimes, and subjective experience when you put on top of that, somebody could have a high heart rate and not experience anxiety. And for a lot of us who think about our physiology is organized around high heart rate is what I experience when I'm anxious. Mm-hmm. It's hard to connect with that from an experiential standpoint. And so there are a lot of questions like that I think they're important to be able to answer, but they're answerable. And you can, sometimes the answer is, I don't know, I got to go read something more about that. That you stumped me. So I think that it's at a point where looking at the body of literature, just that I've read about, which is, I'm sure, a very small portion of what's totally out there. It's used in a lot of different places, from athletic training to predicting affective instability in daily life. And I've seen it in some business-related articles about using this as an understanding, maybe not the measure itself, but as a way of understanding how to organize meetings and how to organize organizational cultures. And it's tied really closely to a lot of good things that we already know. Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of ways, it's kind of confirming what we know, and then it's also expanding what we didn't know. Like your example of maybe this video game is having an impact on my biology that I didn't know about before. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the cool things that you said about that, and kind of round out what advice I would give to people, is being open to new experiences, and the way that just being more in tune with your internal state using a measure that you wouldn't have any other way, mm-hmm. really can kind of help you to organize things in a different way. And you go as you learn as you go, essentially. Yeah. Like once you start measuring something, and like, as they say, what gets measured gets done. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, that holds true with this. Yeah. As you measure it, you get more in tune with both your own internal state and the internal state of others. And it really helps you be more effective in interacting with yourself and with others.
Yeah. Well, when I think the cool thing of where the technology's going is, with Welltory, the thing that I'm using is it tells you where, it doesn't just give you a number. And I think that's the really cool thing. They believe that they have enough data built up over time from different readings. And it sounds like, I looked at the science, sounds like they've really collected more data than seems like anybody else on these baselines. And, so you get told where you're at, you get told kind of also where you're at compared to other readings, and then what you need to do per the state that you're sort of in, what's the healthiest next step. So it's like, it's not like, hey, I get a number and it's like, my heart rate's at a 60 right now. It's like, it tells you kind of what to do. And it usually seems like if I listen to it, it's right, which sometimes I hate to admit, like when I gave up caffeine. But Jerry, what would you give people advice on this right now?
Well, I think people have to look at what's the priority in their programs. Mm-hmm. Right? So, for example, when we look at, if we get more data and understanding that, it might be that we did research that lots of kids coming into residential have low heart rate variability.
Mm-hmm.
So I set the program up designed to deal with low heart rate variability, right?
Right.
And one of the things that the research is telling us is that people who approach suffering in others with compassion, it alters their heart rate variability.
Yeah.
Right? So when we train people about trauma and about how people have to adapt to situations and they're doing the best they can, when we give that knowledge to our staff in our building, and instead of them trying to seek compliance and obedience and other things, that actually changes the staff's heart rate variability, which in some ways makes them stay more socially engaged with the clients, which has a higher likelihood of altering the client's heart rate variability, right? So I could take some of this science to begin to say is, I don't have to measure everybody. Maybe that's something I want to do, and there's really, as science moves, it may be cheaper and more, right? But really there's some generalizations we can make. For example, how many kids come into residential that have self-regulation issues? Right? So
how many have trauma? Yeah.
So I got to measure everybody to find out, right? So in a way, I have to prepare my staff to be well regulated, really attentive, really attuned, really responsive, and I've got to create the structures to support them doing that. To kind of looking at those things. So if we take this literature that's beginning to help us say, this creates stress sensitivity, and I'm bringing in clients who are highly stress sensitive, what do I do to decrease the stress, right? Consistency, structure, predictability, all those things become talking to them about so they know what the treatment's going and what we're being transparent, giving them choice and voice in the process to kind of do all those things that we hear about trauma-informed principles are designed for people with low heart rate variability.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the extreme would be is, yes, you go out and you buy equipment and you measure everybody. The other piece is you use this literature to guide your program design and training and support of the staff that are providing those kinds of things. And when they get dysregulated, how do you respond to them in a way to get them back in their window of tolerance and kind of looking at some of those things. Yeah. So I think that we spend this much time over episodes talking about this. So hopefully not everybody's going to go and measure it, but it could validate some things they're already doing in their program of which they have to increase the efforts to do it. And some things that they have where they're just holding people accountable for points and other things. And it's not that point systems can't be good or bad in some situations, but if I'm using it as a compliance model, not as a treatment intervention, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? These, as Curt will talk, as he talks, you get a sense of these concepts of reinforcement, of understanding, are really complex. So you can't just say, I'm going to create a program and everybody who comes through this is going to get the, really it's a way more complex process. So my takeaway is, Matt, if you were designing your program, I would bring this literature to you and say, your kids are coming in and your families are coming in with low heart rate variability. What are you doing in your program design to address that? Right? And
really, that's the trauma-informed principles we've discussed for 69 episodes in some ways.
There you go, right? Yeah. So it's not, they didn't just pick those principles up out of nowhere. They went to the literature, looked at the literature and said, what is this telling us about how our treatment approaches, how our educational approaches, how our coaching models, all these things have to change in order to increase the efficiency of our biological systems to do what they optimally could do.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I know everybody can't run out and buy heart rate monitors because they're not cheap. And to get variable heart rate is even a little bit more difficult with our current technology. I mean, I think that what it gives you, though, is, and again, heart rate might be where we're at more technology-wise, is, really looking at, a real key, I think, quality measure in some ways when I think about this, about how well our interventions are doing. And I think it gives us state information as well, because I think we in some ways know the trait information with populations a lot of times, but it gives us more of, okay, where's this person at 1 p.m.?
I may want to ask my team, I'm more interested in them staying open and engaged to the clients.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So I may, as we go to team meetings, say, let's take a moment to take our heart rate variability, right? It's like, let's take a little, if it's really low, let's take some time to just, before I start drilling you with information, let's get ourselves ready. Yeah. I may talk to a foster parent about that, right? To kind of look at some of those types of things. So in a way, it's a very useful measure. But what I don't want people to leave to say is, well, if I don't go and get a measure out there, it's not a useful information for me.
Right, absolutely.
We just spent all this time to help you understand why the trauma-informed principles and practices that you're placing into your program are really essential, and they're supported by the biological data we're finding.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I added a question that I want to finish on. So I'll just support what Jerry said, because one of my questions was about our own health and self-care. And I think I would highly encourage people to, again, you can get these apps for free. Obviously, with all apps, if you pay a little bit more, you get more data. But, I think this is, because I think there's a future to this. And so trying to learn about yourself, I think, is a very useful tool. So my question was, should we think about this with our own self-care? I think, Jerry, I love your example of before we start meetings, starting to integrate this with us and our own culture is a great place to start. I kind of look at this as mindfulness, as I think mindfulness will just grow in popularity. The research is incredible. And where we start is our own practice. Because if we're not practicing, we shouldn't be probably teaching it to other folks. And I see this like this. And that allows me to get to my last question here is heart rate variability a theory of everything? In some ways, I mean, is this a heart rate variability informed instead of, because it seems to measure trauma and so is it a kind of theory of everything, even maybe more so than, what we've traditionally called trauma informed?
I'll answer that, and then I'll let Curt maybe end the session. Is when we are in relation that's biologically responsible and responsive, we are healthier. Right? When we create systems and practices that are sensitive to the developmental rhythms and needs of our clients, of our students, of our children, right? When we are better regulated, open and curious and compassionate, we're going to create open and curious and compassionate children to kind of looking at that, right? And so is it really, when we understand our biology and design the environments and the experiences that are sensitive to that, we all do better. So that's my answer to that question.
I think as I look at trauma-informed care, Matt, like to kind of like directly answer that question, and one of the things that I think was a major goal of trauma-informed care was to better connect with each individual person and better understand each individual person. And to that end, I think that heart rate variability has great promise for individualizing care in a really fundamental way. So I don't think that it's a different paradigm, and I don't think that. I think that it's a part of an existing paradigm, but it has some really, really great implications and potential for further individualizing care, which I think is kind of the whole point of a trauma-informed approach and connecting with each individual in a fundamental way. And that's one of the most exciting things I think about heart rate variability.
Right. And that's the hard part of calling this trauma informed. People get stuck on the trauma. And really what we are understanding is because the impact of stress, we really want to get to resilience.
Yeah.
Right. And we should be a resilient informed systems. Right. As opposed to just trauma. Because as soon as we hear trauma, it's like, oh, that's for those 6 people over there in the corner over there that are really being angry and throwing things or cutting on themselves. Is like, this is about all of our biology, as you're over and over talking about how it's helping you in your own life.
Mm-hmm. Great. What a discussion. This was fun. So I hope our listeners enjoyed it as much as I did. So Curt, Jerry, thanks for letting me put you through the last hour. This was a blast. I think I got a lot more understanding as well with this, and I'm sort of I'm with you on the resiliency thing, though. I think we need to figure out what we mean when we say resiliency, because I think, again, kids are surviving horrific situations. They wake up every day and face life, and yet we know that it doesn't necessarily sometimes help them move forward. So,
but it's creating wear and what they're living through is creating wear and tear on their bodies.
Exactly.
So they're surviving that. So we want them to be in a healthier biological state, in a healthier relational environment that allows them not to be in that high state of arousal all the time to kind of look at that, right? So again, is yes, oh, they survived and kids can manage a lot of things. It's like, yeah, but there's a cost to that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, this might be a measure that helps us see the translation between the resiliency to survive and post-traumatic growth, too. And I think, that when I put that in the language, it helps. So a great discussion. I really appreciate this. As always, you can find show notes of videos and everything else, discussion questions at traumainformedlens.org. So we'll see you next week for episode 70, the big 70, and we'll continue our conversations on heart rate variability. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful week.